today we're going to be responding to a video by, I think, DJW, um, and so he had 10 questions for Christians. So we will be responding to that. It's me and Neck. Neck, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool. So yeah, I guess I'll just get started on this.
Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is not my first 10 questions video. I did one earlier, specifically addressed to apologist Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio. As of this recording, he has not responded to my questions. By contrast, this list of 10 questions is aimed at any Christian who wants to answer them. I won't pretend that I'm not asking them in order to prove a point, but I have framed them in a way that actually invites an answer, so as to hopefully not waste anyone's time. Here are the 10 questions I would like to ask Christians. 1. Why is there something rather than nothing? When I say something, I include God. You believe that everything other than God exists because God created it, but why does God exist rather than not exist? If your answer is that God is somehow logically or metaphysically necessary, then what logical or metaphysical contradiction results from the non existence of God? 2.
Okay, so yeah, I guess we'll just respond to this one first. Um, so I think this one depends largely based upon how you think you ultimately answer questions in an ultimate way, because a lot of people will say that at the foundation of like all of our knowledge is just like baseless assumptions that we make. I hear a lot of atheists make that claim. Um, I think a more rational position is that at the basis of all of our like explanations is something that's self-explanatory, um, something that um, explains itself. So there's a stopping point to the question of like why is this the case, right? Because otherwise we have an infinite regress, or we just have like assertions, baseless assertions. And so in the Thomistic tradition, which I'm coming from, of course, is going to be the case that what's ultimately self explanatory, or the foundation of all explanation, is being or existence. Um, and so, in the Thomistic tradition, what God is, his essence, is being or existence. And so God exists because, for self explanatory reasons, basically. Um, in other words, by understanding what God is, you can understand that God exists, and the statement that God exists is true. Um, and he also asks, like, is it contradictory? Or how do you make a contradiction for God not to exist? Well, I mean, in this case, since God is existence, it's a contradiction for him not to exist. But also, I would say that God is sort of more fundamental than the law of non-contradiction in a sense, because the law of non-contradiction is basically being is not non-being. So it comes from our understanding of what being is, and so it ultimately is going to be derived from God's nature. And so, uh, um, rather than saying, God exists because it would be a contradiction for him to not exist, I would say that God exists because uh, because of it's self-explanatory, basically, or self-evident. Not self-evident to us, of course, so I'm not making the ontological argument, but self-evident in itself. Do you have anything to add to that, Nick?
Yeah, that sort of that latter point um with I think I think you phrased it quite well. Um, I would personally sort of struggle to think. Well, you know that God exists because because it'd be contradictory for him not to. But it seems like if you're saying that there's something outside of and more fundamental than God that sort of that's responsible for that. But you put it well that it's it comes from God's nature. The law of non-contradiction would come from God's nature. So really when we talk about knowing why it's like contradictory for God to not exist, where would it's more fundamental to us. Well, the law of non-contradiction is more fundamental to us in the sense that we know it more intuitively. We know it before we know God in some way, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a difference between being ontologically prior and epistemologically prior, in the sense
Yeah,
that,
that's what I'm
like,
getting at.
right, yeah, and what we know first are things. And so this is why St. Thomas would be against the ontological argument, because he thinks that we know, finite creatures in the world first, and then we go from that to God. Um, and um, so yeah, so the being that we know is going to be in creatures, and then we get to God. But since God is being itself, like in an unlimited sort of way, we can still, apply the sort of idea that, logic's going to apply to him, for example. Even though, I mean, it's more derived from, and that's what you were saying, was that, yeah, we don't want to say that logic is prior to God and God exists because of logic. um, Rather, we want to say that logic exists because of God, or because of being, and that what being is, and that being cannot be not being. So, yeah, I think we covered that pretty uh, extensively. So let's move on to the second point.
If current trends continue, Islam will overtake Christianity as the largest religion in the world roughly a few decades from now. Assuming this actually happens, and assuming the Islamic God doesn't actually exist, do you think this overtaking of Christianity by Islam is better explained under Christian theism or under naturalism? 3.
Okay. Do you want to take this one first?
Oh man, um, I want to hear what you have to say about it first.
Oh, okay. Uh, yeah, so I mean, I would say that it's better explained under theism, because, well, you'd have to ask, like, why do these people believe in God in the first place? Um, 'cause- so the actual overtaking of in popularity, I don't think that that has anything to do with whether theism is true or naturalism is true. It's just, people deciding to join a religion. But, you know, I would ask this person, why are people becoming theists in the first place? Is it just, I mean, because, like, from their perspective, well, I don't really know much about these people in general, but a lot of atheists will say, oh, well, there's zero evidence for God. Well, then why are there so many theists in the first place? So, from my perspective, the fact that we even have these people, you know, is it's more expected under a view where God exists than under a view where there's no God, and, there's just no evidence for the existence of God. But I mean, overall, I don't think that this really goes in either direction very strongly, you know? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a rather strange question, because it frames it as if as if Christian theism and naturalism are sort of like theories, and then it's like, hey, which is the best theory for explaining such and such a phenomenon. Um, I think it really goes either way as well. Because I mean, like I would sort of disagree with your point, which is basically, uh, like regarding the existence of theists and the existence of converts being sort of better explained by theism being true, uh, or that it would follow in some sort of or perhaps in some sort of logical way. Um, I think the naturalists, they have a sort of alternate explanations. Like it's sort of the usual explanation for the existence of religion in the first place, and that's not even counting the religion as bad science stuff, but it's more like a group think, and the sort of a sense of identity around a certain idea. Or I don't think that adequately explains um, religion. Um, that being said, uh, I, I don't think I don't think the increasing popularity of Islam is really sort of should really worry the Christian. I think it's sort of um, within our predictive models, let's say, right? And we started with uh, we started with 12 men in the upper room of a house, and then and we can go, we can just go back to 12 men in the upper room of some house um, hiding from the authorities. I don't think there's any sort of um,
Yeah,
there's any sort of contradiction in that when it comes to sort of Christian thought.
yeah, no, I mean, I don't either because, like, I mean, yeah, I mean, we don't really hold that necessarily the vast majority of people are going to be Christians. Like, I don't know I don't know what he's thinking. Like, I mean, he must be thinking that, well, if God existed, he wouldn't allow Muslims to take over, and he would only allow Christians to take over, and then Christians to sort of rule the world, and eventually everybody converts to Christianity. It seems like that's maybe his point. He doesn't really explain, but I'm assuming that's what he means. But of course, I mean, under Christianity, our view is ultimately that what's going to happen is, the world's going to be corrupted, and then God's going to judge the world. And I mean, even Christ said that, the way is narrow and few will find the way, to heaven, basically. So yeah, I don't see how under Christianity why we wouldn't necessarily predict that most people would be Christians. So I don't think this contradicts
Yeah, that the
it in any
majority
way.
of that the majority of the majority of the world, I mean, comparatively to that, Christianity is the most popular religious stance. It's sort of well, you could call I think the naturalists would call it a sort of a historical accident. It just happened to happen. But I don't I
Right. Well, that
you could say something akin to that, but obviously, like, we both
well, well,
we both believe in, like, providence.
well, yeah, and I mean, this is part of my point whenever I was saying that it's more supportive of theism. Is like, do you really think it's an accident that Christianity took over the entire world? No, I mean, there's a reason, and I don't think people are mostly just, complete morons, as atheists seem to think, that just believe whatever somebody tells them. I think that the reason why people started converting to Christianity is because they had good arguments for Christianity. Um, and so yeah, that's what
Of
I'm
course,
gonna
there's
say.
well, of course, like I think this links to like the emergence of Christianity as the most popular religion in the world. Um, uh, and like the atheist necessarily has to view that as a historical accident. That's like, oh, it's like, oh, it just happened to emerge in like this backwater bit of the Roman Empire, and then sort of continued and became very popular by some strange historical accident. But
Yeah,
and obviously that's just because we have to assume naturalism, right? Like you can't actually have um, you, you, you can't have any sort of anything interfere with that because they've got a closed system and they have to assume that. I think
yeah,
we've covered this.
yep. Yeah. So I mean, to summarize, I think that basically, I think the general idea is that we have is that this doesn't really surprise us, no, and uh, you know, it doesn't seem to count any way against the idea that Christianity is true, because like I mean, even though I'm saying that it's like slightly more likely that that theism's true because a lot of people believe in it, or at least it hints at an idea that there's probably some sort of evidence for it. Ultimately, the reason why we believe in Christianity and theism in general is because of the, proofs, the evidence for it. And so, population sizes, even if it was like slight evidence, I don't think it would be strong enough evidence to, overcome those metaphysical arguments um, and historical arguments. Anyway, we should move on to the next part probably because I don't want to get stuck on this part.
What, in your opinion, is the most compelling argument for atheism? Why do you think it is the best one, and why do you believe it fails? Note that I'm talking about a positive argument for atheism, such as the argument from evil. I recently asked an apologist this question, and he told me that the best argument for atheism is the idea that the universe could be a result of quantum fluctuation or an abstract object. But that's not an argument for atheism. That's a response to an argument for theism, specifically a cosmological argument. What I'm asking is, what is the best argument for the non-existence of God in your opinion, and why do you believe it fails?
Okay, so I guess I'll respond to this. I think the best argument is going to be something along the lines of sort of the argument from evil, sort of. I think more maybe somewhere between that and like the argument from divine hiddenness. I mean, what makes me question the most is like thinking about like why isn't God more like present in the world? Like, why isn't it the case that we can more directly hear and talk to God? Uh, so that would be probably the best argument for atheism in my opinion. However, I don't think that it works because uh, so whenever I think that what we're doing whenever we're thinking about it this way is we're thinking about, well, if I were God, this is what I would do. And, we're not God. And there's no reason for us to expect that God would do the same thing that we would, especially from a sort of Thomistic view, because from our view, God is just existence itself. He has an intellect and an analogous sense to us, but there's no reason for us to think that God would be just like us and do what we would do. Um, and also, uh, he, he could have good reasons that we're not aware of. And I mean, I could even think of hypothetical reasons, um, like for example, that, for example, even if God spoke to us directly, how do we know it's God, right? We wouldn't really know that it's God. It could be an alien, it could be something else. So it doesn't really increase any probability that God exists.
Mm.
Um, the metaphysical arguments for God's existence, however, point directly to God. And, I think ultimately, beyond like directly seeing God himself, which, is reserved for the afterlife, because basically God wants us to obtain merit in this life. Beyond that, I think that the metaphysical arguments are probably the only way to really prove that God exists, because anything else would just be like miracles and stuff that people think they want from God. Those things wouldn't necessarily prove that God exists unless it's something that only God could do. Um, so yeah, that's my thought. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I was going to go with the um, well, there's a few variations of the argument from evil, um, but uh, but generally, I think although that one doesn't, obviously, I don't think it logically follows. Uh, wouldn't believe what I believe otherwise. I think it's rhetorically the uh, well, yeah, I think it's probably stronger rhetorically um than the argument from than divine hiddenness, right? And I think it's just because people have such the way it's usually phrased is you have some sort of example. You have like some um, some very imaginative description of starving children or cancer or something. Um, and and because of that, I think it works very well as a rhetorical argument because it really pulls at people's heartstrings, right? Um, but something like and obviously I think it fails because it doesn't follow from the imperfection of the world, which is finite, right? Um, that um, that God, either doesn't exist or isn't all good, um, or anything like that. It's so it's perfectly, I think, perfectly well accounted for
Yeah,
within
I think that
theism.
here they're also a lot of times they're being like, well, if I were God, I would not allow suffering of children, or for example, which again, I don't think that that's really just because you wouldn't do it if you're God doesn't mean that God wouldn't do it, which is basically what you're trying to say. Saying if God existed, sorry, if God existed, God would not allow the suffering of children. But just because you wouldn't allow it doesn't mean that God wouldn't allow it. And just because you can't see some sort of valid justification for allowing it doesn't mean that God doesn't have a valid justification for allowing it. And so, I mean, the best you could do, so logically you can't prove it because there could always be some kind of valid justification for these things. The best you could do is say, well, there probably isn't a valid justification. But then you're just making a probabilistic argument. And even if I grant you that, there are going to be, metaphysically certain arguments that God exists. And so you're comparing, probabilistic arguments, metaphysically certain arguments. And I mean, obviously, the metaphysically certain arguments are going to win over. So I just don't think that this, even if I grant that it has a probabilistic value, which I'm not going to do anyway, but even if I grant that, it's not, and it's never going to be strong enough to, as a probabilistic argument, to overcome the metaphysically certain arguments we have for the existence of God and for the fact that God is all good. So, do you have anything else to say on this point?
Yeah, I think just the last thing to add is this I think is one of the problems that stems, but specifically the thing about, oh, if I were God, I would, do this differently, is just a problem that stems from the over anthropomorphization of God, right? And that's obviously linked to the common atheist problem of mistaking God for a lowercase g God, thinking that he's just sort of fickle like people are, right? So think,
Right,
oh,
yeah.
God's like a guy, it's a very common problem, and the consequences of this error in thinking are very wide spanning. I think it reaches this uh, topic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you never see an atheist, or I mean, I don't know about never, but I've never seen it. Maybe there is somewhere in the literature, but I haven't really seen an atheist approach um, the argument from evil from the perspective of saying, like the metaphysics of like what God is. More, I see it being like, um, well, it's evil for persons to do this, and I don't like it, and therefore God shouldn't God doesn't exist. And I mean, another thing with respect to this is whenever they say that something's evil, all that they mean is I don't like it. So they don't even have like, I mean, they don't have an objective standard of morality anyway, and then um, so ultimately they're saying I don't like it, and I don't like that God does it, allows us evil. And so I don't believe that God exists. That's not a valid argument at all. Like just because you don't like something doesn't mean that God wouldn't do it. So, but there are more serious responses than that. So, which I think my previous comments respond to sufficiently. So we'll continue to the next point.
4. Do you interpret verses such as Romans chapter 1 verse 20 to mean that God's existence is obvious to all and that all professed atheists are either lying or willfully suppressing the evidence? If so, how do you deal with the possibility that if you're wrong and there are atheists who are not willfully suppressing the truth, you have made their atheism self-justifying? Because if the existence of God entails that I am not an inculpable atheist, and I know that I am an inculpable atheist, that's all the proof I need that God doesn't exist. Can you truthfully say that that doesn't worry you? 5.
Okay, so this is more like responding to people who are presuppositionalists, which I am not one. So I would not interpret the Romans 120 that way. Um, so I think here, let me just read what it says for the audience's sake. So it says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood in what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So I don't interpret this as God's existence just like being um, sort of um, intuitively known, or sort of like known self-evidently, or just like everybody automatically knows that God exists. I think what it's talking about is God's um, invisible qualities being known from the effects that he causes. So, for example, through the argument for motion, from the fact that change exists, um, from the fact that composite beings exist, and stuff like that that God exists. So, um, I wouldn't say that everyone necessarily knows that God exists, or that it's impossible for somebody to um, be ignorant of God's existence. However, I do think that I do agree with the part where it says that people are without excuse, in the sense that there is a way for people to easily discover that God exists. I mean, especially nowadays. I mean, a quick Google search and you'll find the argument for motions for God's existence. Um, and I think that people who I think that there can still be people who like read read like objections to it and think, oh well, these objections sound good and the argument for motion doesn't work. But I think if they actually put the due diligence into it of actually understanding it, understanding the objections, understanding uh, whether they work or not, I think they'll find out that the objections don't work and the argument for motion is valid and sound. So yeah, so I think that it's very unlikely that throughout an entire life of a person somebody's going to be invincibly ignorant unless they die young or something. So for the vast majority of people, it's going to be true that they're going to be without excuse, at least on a lifetime scale. Um, so so yeah, I don't think that the following stuff that he said about um, himself being a um, being sure that he's actually honestly not sure that God exists, being evidence against God's existence. I don't think that that would follow because he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't know that tomorrow he's not going to discover that God exists, for example, or um, and you know, I highly doubt. I mean, I don't really know much about this guy, but I can tell you right now he probably doesn't know anything about the argument for motion, just from my experience with new atheists. So anyway, what do you think, Nick?
Well, I think with re regarding that excerpt from Romans 1, well, of course you make a good point that it's very easy to discover. Well, it's easy. The evidence is available to um, a large number of people, especially in the society in which we live, where information is so free available. But of course, you have to think of this in the um, think about that in the context in which Saint Paul wrote.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
obviously
true.
this wasn't really the case, right? Like 2,000
Well,
years ago.
yeah, that's true, but in the context that he wrote, of course, we had Aristotle and Plato.
Yeah, but
Um,
it's not like these things were, their writings um, were actually available to to like the people in question.
well,
Um,
um, I mean, it
I
would have
think it's
been
really,
it would have
I think what it's getting at is more of it's probably more of an intuitive um, an intuitive knowledge of the existence of God, because we can of course we both know about it. And we can show how the existence of God logically follows from things that we know about the world. But I think this isn't getting at that. Well, I think I don't think the Holy Spirit, of course, is limiting himself to one to one sort of understanding of the passage there, right? Um, but within the original context, if you think about it, like with that in mind, I think there's still this intuitive understanding um, that God exists. That is that that is more freely available. Like you just look, it's like you have Christians without any sort of philosophical background going, look at the trees. How come, like, how can you think there's no God? And they're not wrong in saying something like that because though it's the existence of God might not be just sort of something we can um, something we can know um, just on its own in a vacuum, right? I think it's intuitive from looking at the world without even having any sort of philosophical background or arguments like that in mind that God exists, and that's probably what it's um, getting at more.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you there. I mean, it says from what has been made, so it's going to be from his effect. Now,
Yes, but that's what I'm talking about. But I'm not. I'm
maybe
saying that there's no
could
physical.
you hold on a second? Maybe um maybe it would be the case that, they don't have like a formal argument. Like they're not actually reading Plato and taking Plato's words and making a formal syllogism, or taking Aristotle's words, making a formal syllogism and stuff like that. But uh, in a very vague way, I think that, you know the uh, the philosophy of the philosophers, although the people, average people, do not read it, they are still influenced by it in a very distant and vague sort of way. And so, whenever I say that, these sort of arguments are sort of like where this is coming from, I'm not saying that they're taking these, they're making a syllogism and saying that, uh, a formal syllogism saying that God exists. I think that they have like more of a general idea that, um, of teleology or whatever, and that things don't tend towards ends without an intelligence or something like that. And they're not saying, they're not making a formal argument, but since they're living in a culture that's formed by these philosophical ideas, they seem intuitive to them. And so this is why, as well, in our current day and age, the idea that, for example, that space time is four dimensional, it's like a four-dimensional block. This seems intuitive to people, even though it's quite clearly um, not intuitive if you're not growing up in this culture where this idea is, sort of prevalent in our culture. And so I'm not really. I don't see myself as really completely disagreeing with you. Um,
No, I mean I agree with what you're saying
yeah,
here. I think it's more of a. I may have phrased it in a way you found problematic.
yeah. I mean, my only thing is, whenever I talk about intuition, it tends to go back towards it's either like immediate grasp of things,
Right. Yeah,
or
I have to keep in mind that intuition obviously it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a reason that some things are intuitive, and the
yeah,
culture that surrounds us is going to be a major influence on what we see as intuitive.
right. And yeah, and also I worry about talking about it in terms of intuition, because some people will interpret that as being,
Just a precept.
yeah, like presup
Yeah.
or something like that, or it's just a priori known. Um, so I don't think I don't think we're disagreeing. I just want to be more clear about like
Sure.
what we're talking about. Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, to summarize, I think, um, yeah. So we don't think I don't well you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you think that everyone necessarily knows that God exists. Like, do you think that there's room for people to honestly um, not know that God exists?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we wouldn't even accept the sort of premise of his question here, and so we would probably stop at this point, because yeah, I think we addressed it good enough. Okay, so let's continue to the next question.
A dystheist is one who believes that God exists but is not all good and is in fact possibly evil. Do you believe that a literal hell exists and is permitted to continue existing? If so, why are you not a dystheist? Or, because I don't want to assume anything, are you a dystheist? 6.
I mean, so the thing about this question, I really don't like this question because he doesn't provide any reasons for believing that, um, you know, sending people to hell would be evil. So I have to kind
Yeah,
of
like
speculate.
like hell is, or like that hell is like the evil place or something.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
like that's not.
so from our perspective, hell is supposed to be, you know, it's a place of justice. So where people who are evil go there, right? People who deserve the punishment, and justice is good. It's not a bad thing to like punish evil people. And these people are who have decided that they want to do evil for the rest of their lives, they're going to be punished for the rest of their lives for loving evil. Um, so I don't think that God is evil for sending people to hell. I think that that's actually a good thing. It's justice. So that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, but it was of course thinking of hell as a conscious choice that people make in this life and in the transition. Let's say you choose you choose God or you choose uh, against God. You prioritize lesser goods over greater goods, and you end up there by your own volition, by your own choice,
Yeah,
with the lack of God that you desire, right? Or lack of God insofar as you don't experience um the beatific vision. You choose not to. Um,
right.
and of
Yeah,
course, we have to consider hell as the default state of man, um, as a consequence of having an eternal soul.
you know, so there's a couple things I should mention. First of all, um, a lot of the objections to hell I hear from atheists is that um, atheists will often say, "Oh, well, you're just going to punish people for not believing in God, and it's not my fault I don't believe in God. There's no evidence for God." And so you can't be punished for invincible ignorance. So that's not the case. You're only punished for invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance, just to be clear, is a case where um, you could not possibly discover that God exists, for example. Um, that would be invincible ignorance. Now, if you could and you just refuse to actually look into it or to do your due diligence in figuring out whether God exists or not, then you can be punished for that. But just, trying honestly to find God and you fail, you're not going to be punished for that. Now, maybe you'll go to hell for other reasons, but you're not going to go to hell for something that you could not choose under Catholicism, general Christian theism. Um, Now, the other thing to point out, so I don't know how true this is, but I was watching a uh, podcast sort of thing on intellectual conservatism about hell, and I think the video is called something like "Why Does God Punish People for Eternity?" or something like that. And the priest there makes an interesting point, and that's that the punishment in hell is actually for the good of those people who are in hell. And what it is he says that the punishment is, and he says this is according to Saint Thomas. The punishment is not allowing them to have the evil things that they desire. And so, like, say somebody desires to murder people, right? And that's his ultimate end, His ultimate end is just to keep murdering people over and over again. So their hell is going to be living in hell, living in this place where they're not allowed to murder people. And because since that's their ultimate end, it's going to be hell to them because they can't have what they ultimately want for happiness. And it's actually good for them because it's not good for people to murder people. And so I thought that was an interesting way of seeing hell, is that hell's actually, the punishment of hell is actually depriving evil people of the evil that they seek. And that's an actual good of them for them. So I thought that was
There's
interesting.
also the there's also the um, objection to how that atheists have of it being um, an eternal punishment. I think that's where a lot of it comes from as well, because we can understand justice for a finite crime being being proportional, right? So let's say you commit some sort of crime and then you're punished for a time, you get sent to jail or whatever, or you pay a fine or something like that, and we consider the justice served. We consider that the crime is proportionate to some money amount or some time served. Um, but what if you see people going to, well, we assume people go to hell for are finite things. A lie is a finite thing, and murdering one person is a finite thing. Um, and of course, there's things we don't consider to be morally incorrect, but that's something else. And you have to consider that these that, that these being uh, crimes against God are not actually, well, they're not actually finite. Um,
Well, um, I think the way to think
in a
about it
relevant
is,
way.
yeah, I think I
God.
think the way to think about it is that, like, murder only takes a second, really. Like, it doesn't take a long time to do. And still, most, you're going to get a long time in prison, longer than a second in prison for murdering people. And so the the way that we actually punish people isn't according to the amount of time that it takes to do the crime, but the severity of the crime. And so so yeah.
Yes, but that's what I'm saying. But then you've got but obviously um of course there's some sort of proportionality to the severity when it comes to punishment in this life. There is an unbridgeable gap between there being you know a proportionate punishment for some what one might consider a finite um, a crime, to there being an infinite punishment. Though I think the infinite duration, right? Let's say of hell is not really where the proportionality comes from, because hell is worse for people who are worse, right? Like you have sections of hell as it's sort of, I suppose, classically taught, where people don't suffer as much, and hell is different for people who were not who in this life were not as vicious as others. But the infinite duration, I think maybe that would just be a consequence um, of man having an eternal soul. TD, you there?
Yeah. Sorry, I was muted. One way of thinking about it is that um, you know, it's the severity. So so things are going to be more severe, the more good that you're going against, basically, or that you're, yeah, that you're, because it's based on intention. So like even if you fail to, um, if you intend to murder people and you fail, your intention still is going to, um, you know, it's significant. It's still morally significant that you intended to do something evil. Um, and so if your intention is against the good itself, the infinite good itself, that's going to merit an infinite punishment because it's a more severe evil. So, I mean, from a theistic perspective, the actual, worst evil that you can ever commit is going to be um, going against, willing against God as your final end. So, yeah, so that would be one reason why it would, an infinite punishment would be proportional. And I mean, another reason to think about it is that whenever people are choosing, a finite good over an infinite good, they're choosing. Um, they're not just choosing it for a finite period of time. They're actually just choosing. Um, they're deciding this is my ultimate end now, and that's actually um, they're deciding God's not my ultimate end, and my ultimate end is this. And so that's not just like a finite thing. That's more of an eternal thing, I think. But I think we went long enough on this point, so let's continue with the video.
Do you believe that the Bible is inerrant, that it is free of error and contradiction? If so, how do you cope with the fact that there are lists of literally thousands of apparent errors and contradictions in the Bible, and only one of those apparent errors or contradictions needs to be an actual error or contradiction in order for the Bible to not be inerrant? If you do not believe the Bible is inerrant, what makes you think that the verses which promise salvation are not errors?
Okay. So first of all, I will note that I've seen these contradictions on these websites and they're mostly ridiculous, honestly. Like for example, the idea that, oh, well, one gospel says that there were two women or three women at the tomb and one only mentions one. And they say, "Oh, well, this is a contradiction." Well, no, it's not. It's just one of the verses only mentions one of the women and it doesn't mention the other two. That's not a contradiction. That's just not mentioning things. That said, I wouldn't, claim there are zero errors inside of the scriptures or contradictions with respect to everything. Rather, and I don't know, I'm not very well informed on the doctrines of the Catholic Church on this particular topic. But my personal opinion right now is that um, basically what what's going to be inerrant or without error is going to be the intent of the authors, what the author's intending to communicate. So, for example, let's say the authors try to communicate that God is all powerful by saying that um, God is, um, you know, he's not limited to any of the four corners of the earth or something like that, right? And so clearly we could say, oh, well, the author made a mistake here. The earth doesn't have four corners. It's actually round. It's not a flat square. Therefore, the Bible is wrong. But what the author there was intending to communicate wasn't that the earth is flat, even if that's sort of like the example that he gave. What he was trying to communicate was that God is omnipresent, that he's all powerful, And so what he was trying to communicate can still be true, even if that example that he gave is not true. And I don't think that, and so I don't think that that's an. So that's sort of like my view. That's sort of how I would approach it. Um, Now, as far as what makes me think that, I think he said with respect to the resurrection, why do I think
Well,
that that part's true?
it was with respect to salvation. So it's
Ah,
so I think you covered this where the intent is preserved, whereas some you might have poetic language or something,
yeah,
or or fine details which may be unimportant,
right.
um, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, with
might not
respect
be
to
preserved.
yeah, with respect to salvation, uh, so I think that the idea that so first of all, I sort of have like an idea about prior probability of God trying to save us because so God obviously created us for perfect happiness, and perfect happiness can only be had with union with Him. And you can see my Proving Christianity series for arguments on that, for more details on that. But yeah, so I think he created us for that. And so I think ultimately God would provide a way, if he created us for that end, for us to actually obtain that end. So there's already a prior probability for God to provide some sort of way of salvation. And so, in addition to that, I think that, you know, the resurrection and so forth, I think that these are major events, major parts of the whole religion. It's not like something that they're going to. It's not like some unimportant detail like how many women were at the tomb. You know, it's a major point in Christianity. Um, um, that I don't think that um, the eyewitnesses who provided the testimony for the Gospels are likely to have just been mistaken about. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to really hold that the Bible is inerrant in any way in order to accept that God is likely to provide a way for salvation, and then show that this is most likely the way of salvation. So, what do you think?
I think the Bible being sort of inerrant in this sort of in this sort of eyebrow raising way isn't really off the table. Um, the so you mentioned contradictions or apparent contradictions, like the number of people or the people present at the tomb. Um, but there's of course the I think what people might find more significant is descriptions of the same events with like number errors. So it's like something like 600 horsemen present or something. And they had like 6,000, which is obviously a pretty big um, change between. I think it was like something in Samuel and then something in Kings. Um, or there's apparent contradictions with like with Genesis. This always comes up with well with the two creation narratives having a sort of a strange chronology. Though I think um, like I think it's still I think it's on the table that that basically any apparent contradictions or anything like that can actually be uh, can actually be explained. Um, like whether it's whether the it's poetic language being used that where the facts the facts of the matter are in a sense that like a news report might value them or not sort of what the important thing is, right? Um,
Yeah.
Going against some sort of overly literalistic interpretations of certain passages, and I think things like numerical errors, like with the cavalry. I think example that I gave can be explained by things like like words being used to describe both an individual cavalryman and then like a group of 10 of them, like a unit, you know. Um, yeah, I don't think it's off the table that there aren't actually any errors or contradictions between any
Yeah,
um,
I'm open to
verses.
that as well.
I would
But
probably lean more towards it. I think I've found anything that's undeniably um, an an error in my time being sort of presented with them.
yeah, I'm open to it. I wouldn't take that position, but I'm open to it. So, but yeah, I don't think. I mean, so what do you think about um? So yeah, I guess you would just say that it doesn't bother you because you don't think that it's going to um. You don't think that it's necessarily true that there are contradictions. Um, and I would say, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily true as well. We could definitely debate that. And even if it were true, I mean, we don't have to hold to this strict version of inerrancy, I don't think.
Yeah,
So,
there's preservation of you know of doctrine and what's important, and that's something uh, that you can fall back on.
yeah,
I suppose if it turns out that there's some sort of minor error within, like this, it's 73 books.
yeah,
There's like I think you have this like astounding number as always 100,000 contradictions or something like that. Into according to some to some website. Um, you know, it,
yeah, and those
it's
are
sure,
disingenuous. Those are completely disingenuous. Like, I
oh yeah, I
mean,
mean I've seen those.
yeah,
If they're basically it's basically a list of references. Uh, like where a verse references another verse. It's like, yeah, great job. You've spotted like cohesion.
yeah. All right, we're already going pretty long, so let's go on to the next part.
7. In many, if not most monarchies, the monarch will every so often appear before the people in the flesh for ceremonial occasions, such as opening a session of government, sending a Christmas greeting, and so on. They appear before their subjects in the same way that any person you know appears before you. And while people may oppose the monarchy, no one of sound mind is in any doubt that the monarch actually exists. Does it bother you that in your entire lifetime God has never done this? Why or why not? 8.
So I actually kind of addressed this whenever I mentioned the argument from divine hiddenness. So I don't want to let's not spend too much time on this, but just to summarize what I said before, basically, I don't think that God appearing to us, unless it was like the beatific vision, which he has good reasons for not doing the beatific vision right now because he wants us to obtain merit. Um, but like, God can't God can't appear to us like in a physical form or well, he can obviously in the form of Christ, for example. But if this guy saw Christ, he would say he was just a human being. He wouldn't say that he's God. So, uh, yeah. So I don't think that first of all, that we think that did happen, but the fact that it's not happening right now, I don't think that it's not really bothersome to me very much. I mean, it is a little bit, but overall, I don't think that it's a great objection to Christianity or theism in general because um, the best arguments for God's existence is going to be a metaphysical argument, not some sort of miracle or something like that.
Yeah, but to be fair, when you have you do have some relatively thorough miraculous claims that work against divine hiddenness, but I don't think that's really the sort of thing um, that's being uh, talked about here. When you have, it's like, okay, why doesn't Christ show up every so often, clothed in white with skin of gold, or whatever the by the description in Revelation, right? Why doesn't he just sort of show up? Um, I think I think God just has good reason for it, right? But though this isn't that, though, as you said, I think I'll agree with you. It is, it is a bit bothersome, right? Like, but we can probably just drum that up to like, well, I would do that if I were God, and that's
Well,
basically just
like I said, if Jesus showed up like that, people would could just say he was an alien or something.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
there's no reason to say that it's God. I mean, there are arguments to say that like God could perform a resurrection. So I'm open to the idea that God could say raise people from the dead all the time, and that would prove that God exists. But I think that those arguments themselves ultimately depend on the metaphysical arguments for God's existence, because you have to. I don't want to go too much into it, but you have to prove that that God is um, the that God is existence itself, et cetera, in order to argue that God is only God is able to um, raise somebody from the dead, and so I think it depends on those metaphysical arguments as well.
Yeah, right. So once you've gotten to the sort of the interpretation of the data, right? Let's say someone's being raised for the dead. Is this evidence for God? You've already, if you've concluded that that would be evidence for God, you've already proved God a few steps back.
Yeah, it depends on the existence of God. Um, so basically, it's like we would expect this is sort of well, only God could do this, and we would have to prove that only God could do this, and that would be based on this idea of the world that it's built in such a way that only God could do it. Whereas, like, say you accept that things just pop into existence for no reason, for example, oh, then, who knows, resurrection, maybe that could just happen, you know? Uh, so, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Let's move on to the next point.
Methodological naturalism is the working assumption that God does not exist, which is necessary to do science. Because if we assume that God exists and has the power to affect results, then we cannot trust any results. Methodological naturalism does not entail metaphysical naturalism, which is the actual position that only the natural world exists and God does not exist. One can assume that God does not exist to do the work of science without actually believing that God does not exist, and in fact, many scientists do. Most Christians seem to be comfortable with the fact that science uses methodological naturalism, and it doesn't bother them. Does it bother you, however, that science using methodological naturalism has been so incredibly successful? Does Christianity predict that such great strides can be made by assuming, even for working purposes, that the most important truth in the universe is false? 9.
Okay, so just a little background on me. I'm actually I'm not practicing right now, but I worked in the field of evolutionary biology for like 6 years. So I would consider myself a scientist. Um, and guess what? I don't use methodological naturalism. I would say I use methodological supernaturalism, which I just mean that I accept that miracles could happen. So, yeah, he's just flatly wrong. You don't have to use methodological naturalism to do science. I have peer-reviewed papers published, no problem whatsoever. I just don't assume that every single thing. I don't assume that God is like constantly, trying to do miracles in random ways. Like for example, like I was studying fruit flies. You know, um, fruit fly behavior. I have no reason to think that God's going to like magically change, affect fruit fly behavior, even if I think that, theism is true. Like, why would God do that? I think God only does miracles for supernatural reasons, for example, to prove that a message is from him, for example. And God just like changing the behavior of a fruit fly would be completely irrational. Like why would he do that? I mean, it's possible, but it's not something that I would expect. It's not something that I would include in my, expectations. And under even if you were a naturalist, you could say, oh well, an alien could just like randomly change the behavior of a fruit fly, but we have no reason to believe that. So it's not that we assume that aliens don't exist that could do that. We just um, we don't assume we don't have any reason to believe that aliens are actually doing that, and so yeah, we don't include that inside of our sort of results. So so yeah, methodological naturalism, not a thing. Um, it, it's not a thing
Or
that has to
rather,
be used.
or rather, it's just I think it's way too far-reaching a definition of methodological naturalism. Like it's. I think you've basically said this in other words, but it's it's not that the assumption is that God doesn't exist. It's that it's the assumption that we don't live in like this occasionalist. I think that's the term, occasionalist world where God's responsible for every individual action, or we're not assuming that God is causing some miraculous act to happen just to mess with your data, right? That's what's required, right? The assumption that that miracles are rare, basically. That's all that's required. You don't need to make this assumption that God doesn't exist. And of course, there's the immediate counter to this, right? That we could pose, right? Um, with uh, science assuming that the world is ordered, right? Whereas uh, uh, you know, whereas by the well, if, I think if you're a consistent naturalist, right? I think there's really much of a uh, reason for denying something like a local order or or anything like the world's fundamentally changing for absolutely no reason, right? I think the world being ordered, which I think is points to a theistic position, something more fundamentally required by science than methodological naturalism. What I think is linked, and it's probably just the same thing but with a different framing. You know, that's that's probably the harder hitter.
Yeah, and I mean, um, yeah. So like, I mean, somebody might counter and say, well, okay, but you just, for the sake of your scientific experiments, you don't include God at all, and that's methodological naturalism. But like, I'm open to the idea that God is involved in any of them. Like, it's possible that God, at some point, um, could try to send me a message through scientific experiments or something like that. I'm open to that. So I'm not just assuming that that's never going to happen. I just need evidence that it actually does happen. So, um, and I'm open to aliens doing it too. I'm open to some sort of freak uh, influence from nature, some sort of, I don't know, solar flare coming happening to affect the behavior of the fruit flies or something. I'm open to that, and you have to be open to that to do actual proper science. You can't
Yeah.
just assume that these things aren't going to happen. Um, so it's just that you need evidence that it actually did happen. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, you're gonna write your fruit flies paper, and then like sure, you're open to the possibility that your results are all invalid because the aliens messed with it, or because God was trying to send you a message by rearranging fruit flies. But you're not gonna put that in parentheses in your paper.
yeah,
It's not worth mentioning.
that's true because there's no evidence of that. And if there were evidence for that, then maybe I
Then you'd
would.
actually mention it. Yeah.
Anyway, all right, let's continue.
Suppose God appeared to you and in such a way that left absolutely no doubt in your mind that it was God and ordered you to commit a moral atrocity such as genocide. Would you do it? 10.
Okay, so I mean, I feel like this is a loaded question because I don't think it's possible for God to actually command us to do a moral atrocity. Now, look, it's possible for God to command us to do something that appears like a moral atrocity, um, from our perspective, but ultimately, God would have to have some sort of justifying reason for doing it, for commanding us to do it. So I don't even think that it's so. So I mean, the answer I can't really answer the question. Like I can't say no because um I I wouldn't say, so I wouldn't go against anything that God tells me to do. However, nothing God that's because nothing God would tell me to do would be contrary to the good. Ultimately, everything that God tells me to do would be in line with the good. And so, I mean, he's just asking me like a logically contradictory thing. He's like, if God, it'd be like saying, if God asked you to create a square circle, would you do it? And it's like, I guess sort of, but no, because it's a
Yeah.
meaningless thing.
Yeah, I mean, like the assumption that's behind the question is that there is some sort of moral framework that exists um separate from God, which I think stems from this sort of lack of really comprehending that like the way in which human morality is uh, tied to God, tied to our teleology, right? How it actually works, right? So it assumes that morality is separate from God, and then it can actually ask the question. So if we
Yeah,
just reject the assumption, then the question becomes, you know, okay, what if God appeared to you, made it clear that it was actually Him, and then because there's like obviously a reference to something like the the various acts of war within many parts of the Old Testament, right? I mean, that's what the atheist is usually getting at when it comes to
right.
this sort of
Yeah,
thing, right? It's like, okay, so um, God comes in and tells you uh, to kill all the newborns of this tribe. Um, uh, would you do it? I mean, the answer is yes, right? Uh, because if God is commanding it, and you know for certain that it's God, then it can't actually be a moral atrocity has to necessarily, right, has to be something that is that is ordered towards the good.
Right. Yeah.
Because yeah, and that's because we believe that God can't actually ask you to do something that is actually uh, immoral.
Right. Well, actually, contrary to the good, because ultimately God has to will Himself as the end, and He is the good, because
Yeah.
nothing else can be the
Yes.
final cause of God, because then He wouldn't really be the first cause if He had a final cause separate from Him.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah, and with respect to genocide or whatever I mean, it's not really genocide, but with respect to, say, killing children and stuff in the Bible, I mean, it's first of all, if God actually did command it, it would have to be good necessarily, in some way. Secondly, we're not. I don't think that's necessarily the only way to interpret it. And, another way of interpreting it possibly would be that it's sort of like hyperbolic language. Um, so, in war times, like I've heard this example before that on a stela, the Egyptians said that they completely eliminated the seed of Israel, and obviously Israel was not completely eliminated. It was just like hyperbolic language. It's just like we completely decimated these people. And so, one way of interpreting it would be to say, well, they're just using hyperbolic war language. They didn't actually completely decimate these people. And I don't know if I actually accept that interpretation. But I'm just saying, there's other possible ways of uh, interpreting it. You don't have to interpret it as actual killing of people, of children or whatever. But even if it were, I, given our ideas about what the good is, it wouldn't be a moral atrocity, even if you feel like it is. So, yeah, I think that summarizes our position pretty well. Let's continue to the next part.
Think of the conceptual problems faced by the average Christian. To believe that a being who committed genocide, killing all but 8 members of an entire species of sentient beings, is worthy not just of respect but of worship. To believe that one man offering himself as a blood sacrifice atones for the misdeeds of an entire race, and that this is morally acceptable. To believe that the source of all truth and all wisdom allows the vast majority of the human race to live in falsehood. To believe that such a vast, such an unfathomably large universe exists just for us in these few thousand square miles of a planet's surface. Christians have considered these problems, and they have arrived at answers that are, if not always intellectually fulfilling, then at least intellectually acceptable to them. Why could atheists, naturalist atheists who believe that only the natural world exists, not do the same thing with any perceived problems with naturalism that you might think of? Could they not arrive at answers that are intellectually acceptable to them? Whatever problem you might think of with atheism, whatever you think the deal breaker is, could atheists not think of a way around it? And if you admit that this is possible, and instead want to focus on the issue of what explains the data better, why should we not prefer the explanatory power of a worldview that does not posit a being who is worthy of worship but commits genocide, who is moral and just but accepts blood sacrifice, and so on? At the very least, isn't naturalism simpler?
Okay, so this is the last question that he asked. So my problem with atheism, like the biggest problem with atheism, is that we have proof for God's existence. So yeah, I don't see how atheism is going to get around that. I mean, I'm not going to be able to like complete. I have videos on this. I'm not going to be able to sufficiently lay out all of the arguments for God's existence here. But I mean, with respect to like the argument from composition, generally it's anything that's composite depends on its parts, and so unless you're going to have an infinite regress of things which are dependent, you need something which is non-dependent, which is not composed of parts, because if it's composed of parts, it's going to be dependent on its parts. And since it's absolutely simple. It doesn't have parts. It at least has to exist, and it can't be anything more than existence. Otherwise, it would be composed of parts. And so it's just existence itself, and that's God. So that's quick and a quick proof of God's existence. Could atheism get around that? No, and it's not really the same as like a probabilistic argument that that he's making for atheism. That, oh well, universe big, you know, if
I don't
why
think it's
is
a
universe
probabilistic
big?
argument for I think he's making that argument with. I mean, it's it's a really. I think this is a really poorly constructed question. I like the question of course the questions of it. It's sort of a two-parter, right? Um, and it's and I think you answered the first part pretty adequately already, right? Like, okay, we well, if a worldview is false, right? So he's asking us, the Christians who believe that naturalism is false. If you believe a worldview is false, right, then you can't also hold that it's entirely consistent with, firstly, the data that you have, and secondly, that it's self-consistent, right? That there are no internal contradictions within it, right? And if it's both of those things, well, if it's not self-contradictory and it's not contradictory to the data that's available, that is out there, right? Then it must be true, right? And if we hold naturalism as false, then either there's going to be some stumbling block, some sort of information that is detrimental to naturalism, that that it can't account for, that it's that proves it false, which I think there is, or it's or it's um, or it's self-contradictory in some way. And if you think naturalism is false, then then necessarily one of these things is going to be the case, right? Um, but the second, well, I think the second bit applies, with it being sort of a like, oh, what explains the data better, uh, sort of in a probabilistic way. Um, but I think it's worth noting that the that naturalism isn't really simpler than supernaturalism.
Well, I I mean,
There's a lot that you have to get through.
even if it were simpler, um, it doesn't actually answer the problems that we have. Like,
Yeah,
uh, you know, y- how do you, you can't have a non. It's like impossible to have a non-composite being that's a natural object. Because I mean, the only thing that could be non-composite is something that's just existence itself. Anything else is going to have existence plus some sort of essence that that makes it um, distinct from existence. Um,
right. And
so
of course,
yeah,
like well, the things given as examples, it's like, oh, like you give me like the Jack Chick version of the crucifixion, and then and then go, oh, like God's God's a mini and space is big, so naturalism is simpler. Like that doesn't make any that bit of it is just very poorly worded, and it's like,
yeah,
you
I think
can't ask this question to a Christian because he rejects the premise already, right? Like, he's like, okay, it's like, okay, we already like, we accept these things, right? We believe that they're true and that we have good reason for them, right? So if you're going to pose some sort of, something like, oh, the universe is really big, right? And then say that naturalism is simpler because of it. Like, we're going to reject that already. So this isn't really an argument that's going to rhetorically work with us.
yeah, I think that he's approaching this from like a perspective of like very simplistic, probabilistic arguments for God's existence. Like, for example, some
Like ID or something.
versions of the fine-tuning arguments, or yeah,
Yeah,
the sort of um,
intelligent design or whatever
Paley's, yeah,
else.
William Paley's design argument, where it's just like, oh well, it looks designed, therefore God exists, or um, you know, the universe is very um, fine-tuned, so it's likely that God did it. And these are not the kind of arguments that we're using. And in response to those, well, saying that, oh well, God probably wouldn't make a universe that's uh, really big and empty if he were just trying to make it for humans. Which, I mean, even that, I don't really see how that logically follows. But whatever. But it's a comparable argument to those sort of arguments, but it's not to these sort of metaphysically rigorous arguments like the argument from composition or the argument from motion. And I think he's probably just not really aware of these arguments, and so he's approaching it from a more simplistic viewpoint.
Right.
Yep. So that was the last question. I think we adequate adequately answered everything. We kind of took a
And it
long time, but
only took us like 11 times longer than the guy's video.
yeah. But hey, I forget your name. I think DJW. Um, yeah,
David
DJW.
John Wellman.
Okay.
Thanks for the video.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I hope you watch this video, and if you want to respond, I'd love to see that. Or if you want to have a discussion sometime, we could do that too. Um, but yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and end it here.